It was at the edge of twilight on an ordinary Tuesday evening that Sarah Collins found herself standing at the foreboding entrance of the long-abandoned Holworth factory. A sturdy woman of 35, Sarah had made a living out of salvaging rare parts from forgotten machines. An order had come in for components found only within the machinery at Holworth, coaxing her into the rusting skeleton of the industrial district. The factory, an industrial leviathan of brick and steel, was an eerie sight. It stood as a ghostly monument to a bygone era, casting long shadows that devoured the faint evening light. Its skeletal remains, under the pale wash of twilight, bore an uncanny resemblance to a desolate haunted house from an old horror movie. With a resolute deep breath, Sarah pushed the creaking factory door and stepped into the gloom. The air inside was heavy and stagnant, tainted with the musty smell of decay and wet rust. The deeply quiet within was only broken by the distant drip of leaking water and the soft scuttle of rats. Her flashlight carved a narrow path through the inky blackness, the narrow beam casting grotesque shadows on the machinery that lay silent and forgotten. As she ventured deeper into the heart of the factory, she discovered an old office, a decaying time capsule in the sea of darkness. Amidst dusty papers and antiquated equipment, a rusted safe sat stubbornly in the corner. It seemed oddly out of place, a silent sentinel holding on to secrets of a time long forgotten. Intrigued, Sarah made a mental note to return with tools from her shop to explore the safe's contents. Just as she was about to leave, the sound of coarse, hushed voices echoed from below. She followed the sound and found herself peering through a cracked floorboard. Below, in the factory's underbelly, a ruthless gang of criminals was plotting. Their faces, scarred by violence and hardship, were lit by the dim glow of a solitary lamp. Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine as she overheard their conversation. They were orchestrating a series of high-stakes robberies across the city, planning to use the factory as a base. The very thought sent a wave of dread washing over her. She realized that she was trapped in a spider web of criminal conspiracy in the bowels of an industrial mausoleum. She needed to escape and alert the authorities, but the factory was a labyrinthine nightmare of corroding machinery and shadowed corners. With each step, the creaking metal and the groaning floors seemed poised to betray her presence. As she navigated through the factory, every rustle and scrape was a specter of imminent danger. In her desperate flight, she stumbled upon an old maintenance phone, miraculously functional despite the decades of neglect. With trembling hands, she dialed 911, her voice barely above a whisper as she relayed the gang's chilling plot. As she hung up, her heart hammered in her chest. She heard the distant echo of footsteps growing louder. They were coming. Sarah bolted, her heart pounding in her ears like a frenzied drumbeat. She could hear the criminals closing in, their shouts echoing in the desolate expanse of the factory. Each thunderous footfall felt like a hunting drum, growing louder and more terrifying with every passing second. She dashed towards the main entrance, her adrenaline-fueled run turning into a desperate sprint. Just as she felt her strength give out, the factory was suddenly flooded with the harsh blare of sirens and the stark flash of red and blue lights. Police swarmed the factory, their sudden arrival disrupting the grim chase. Sarah was quickly taken to safety as the gang was apprehended. Her terrifying ordeal had not only prevented a citywide crime spree, but also unmasked the criminal underbelly lurking within the city's industrial ghost. However, despite emerging as an unsung hero, the terrifying events of that night left a permanent scar. The once forgotten Holworth factory had become a symbol of hidden terrors, a grim reminder of the darkness that could fester within the decaying bones of the city's past. The park was bathed in an eerie moonlight, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced with every rustle of the wind. A young man, barely 18, sat alone on a park bench, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm of a life that was not his own. I watched him from a distance, my heart pounding in sync with the one I had lost. The heart, Mary's heart, was beating inside this young man. It was a chilling thought, one that filled me with a strange mix of grief and determination. I approached him, my footsteps muffled by the soft grass. He didn't see me until it was too late. I struck swiftly, a small, sharp blade in my hand. It was over in seconds. I left his lifeless body on the bench, a small incision in his chest, the only sign of my gruesome act. The heart, still warm, was now in my possession. I hadn't always been this way. I was once a man of action, a private investigator who had seen the worst that humanity had to offer. But nothing could have prepared me for the loss of my wife, Mary. The car accident was sudden, brutal, and left a gaping hole in my life that I couldn't fill. Mary was vibrant, full of life and love. Her laughter filled our home. Her love filled my heart. She had always wanted to be a mother, but medical complications had made it impossible. In the aftermath of her death, I learned that Mary's organs had been donated. A part of her was still living, still giving, even in death. This thought consumed me, gnawed at me until I could think of nothing else. I had to bring her back, piece by piece, organ by organ. The heart was just the beginning. The liver, the kidneys, each organ was tracked down with the same ruthless efficiency I had once used to hunt down criminals. Each organ was retrieved with surgical precision, leaving a trail of bodies in my wake. Each retrieval was a horror show of its own. The terror in the eyes of the recipients as they realized what was happening, the life draining from them as I claimed what was once Mary's. As I collected each organ, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. I was bringing Mary back, fulfilling her wish to give life. But with each life I took, a part of me died. I was becoming a monster, and I knew it. I looked at the organs, each one carefully preserved in a glass jar. The heart, the liver, the kidneys. Each one a part of Mary, each one a part of me. And as I looked at them, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. I had brought Mary back, in a way, but at what cost? The police had found me in my home, surrounded by the organs I had collected. They had arrested me, charged me with multiple counts of murder. I was sentenced to death by lethal injection. The prison cell was cold, the walls closing in on me. I could hear the distant sounds of the prison, the clanging of bars, the muffled voices of guards. But all I could think about was Mary, her laughter, her love, her life. All gone, all lost. And all I had left were her organs, her pieces, her parts. I could still remember the smell of her perfume, the sound of her voice, the touch of her skin. I could still remember the way she looked at me, the way she loved me. And so, as I lay on the execution table, the lethal injection ready to end my life, and I thought about the lives I had taken, the lives I had destroyed, but I felt no remorse. I had done it for love, for Mary. It's an average Tuesday evening, and Dan, a middle-aged high school English teacher, strolls into Walmart. Dan has always been a night owl, preferring the solitude and tranquility of the after hours for his grocery shopping. He leaves his small studio apartment only to immerse himself in the artificial white light of the Walmart, a soothing contrast to the looming darkness outside. Dan gets what he needs: a dozen eggs, bread, some beer, and a few miscellaneous items. The store, almost deserted, feels like an eerie mausoleum of commerce. As he moves toward the checkout, he notices a new checkout operator, one he's never seen before. A peculiarly tall, skeletal man with gaunt cheeks and sharp, penetrating eyes. His name tag reads Damon. Damon scans Dan's items, his movements graceful and serpentine. He smiles at Dan, revealing a set of pristine white teeth, incongruously vibrant against his pallid complexion. As their eyes meet, Dan feels a shiver race down his spine, but he dismisses it as the product of his overactive imagination. The following week, Dan returns to Walmart for his nocturnal shopping routine. Damon is there, perched behind the checkout counter like an uncanny statue. Dan picks up the faint smell of sulfur wafting from his direction. Once again, Damon scans his items, their eyes meet, and the same shiver trickles down Dan's spine. This time, though, the frigid wave of fear doesn't dissipate quickly. Week after week, the pattern continues. Each time Damon is present, his smile ever widening, his eyes growing more intense. Dan begins to dread his weekly shopping trips, but he can't pinpoint why. He tries to change his schedule, but circumstances conspire to keep him on his late-night routine. Dan's students notice their usually jovial teacher is off. His friends, too, sense his discomfort, but Dan can't articulate his fears, rooted as they are in the inexplicable. He begins to lose sleep, plagued by nightmares of being trapped in the endless aisles of Walmart. pursued by a shadowy figure. One night, Dan has no choice but to visit Walmart again. As he pushes his cart towards Damon, he sees the tall cashier standing at the end of an impossibly long checkout counter, his eyes gleaming in the harsh fluorescent light. As he approaches, the walls of the store seem to undulate, warping and twisting like a funhouse mirror. He dumps his items onto the conveyor belt. Damon's fingers move faster. The beeping of the scanner syncs with his pounding heartbeat. Suddenly, Damon stops. He holds up a pack of Dan's favorite coffee, his bony fingers gripping the edges. "Missing something, aren't we, Dan?" His voice is soft and melodious, but it echoes around the empty store. Dan looks at him, bewildered. "You're asleep, Dan. You're missing your sleep." Damon smiles, his teeth glowing. Dan's heart freezes. How does Damon know about his sleep troubles? As if reading his mind, Damon says, "I can help you, Dan. I can help you sleep. I can take away the dread that's been haunting you." As Damon extends his hand, the walls melt away, revealing an abyss. The cashier's counter morphs into a monstrous snake, Damon sitting atop, grinning. Dan screams, backing away, but his feet refuse to move. And then he wakes up. He's not in Walmart, but in his bed, drenched in sweat. It's morning. The sun is shining. A sigh of relief escapes him. It was just a dream. Later, as Dan is making coffee, he pauses. He didn't buy coffee the previous week. He had meant to, but Damon distracted him. He opens his cabinet, and there it is, his favorite coffee pack, exactly like in his dream. In the cold light of day, the impossibility of it hits him. Was it just a dream, or was Damon more than a mere checkout operator? Was he a psychic vampire feeding off Dan's deepest fears and insecurities? Dan didn't know, and he wasn't sure he ever wanted to find out. He knew one thing, though. He was never setting foot in that Walmart again. The skyline of the city was dominated by massive structures, but tonight, one tower stood out less than the others. The towering office building I worked in was enshrouded in an abyss of darkness, its glass and steel facade blending into the obsidian night. Lights from neighboring skyscrapers failed to penetrate its opaque visage. But inside, one of the top floors was still dimly illuminated. There, a single desk light pooled its glow on stacks of papers and an exhausted worker, me. Another project with an impossible deadline meant burning the midnight oil. And so, once again, I found myself working late, wrapping up the intricate designs of my latest architectural project. The muffled hum of the HVAC system was the only sound accompanying the soft scribbles of my pen. With each passing hour, the office had emptied out, leaving behind only the ghost of echoed footsteps and hushed conversations. Finally, the ornate clock that I had inherited from my grandfather signaled that it was midnight. Its chimes were both a comfort and a reminder that the world outside still moved at its normal pace. Rubbing my tired eyes, I decided to call it a day. Packing up my things, I began my lonely journey to the underground parking lot, using the elevator's descent as a moment of reflection and transition from work mode to the anticipation of home's warmth. Reaching the parking level, the atmosphere shifted. The once bustling space during the day now exuded an eerie silence. The dim overhead lights did little to stave off the shadows that clung to the corners. Rows of cars stood like silent sentinels, their polished surfaces reflecting the feeble luminescence. Unlocking my car, I was enveloped by its familiar scent and comfort. But as I settled in and adjusted the rearview mirror, my heart catapulted into my throat. There was a shadowy figure, a man sitting in the back seat. His eyes, cold and calculating, met mine through the mirror. "Drive," he ordered, voice as sharp as shattered glass. My body went rigid, each nerve ending screaming of the imminent danger. But the paralysis of fear was momentarily overridden by the primal need for self-preservation. Without a word, I obeyed, guiding the car through the spiraling exit of the garage, each turn echoing with the weight of dread. As the city's skyline unfolded before us, his directives became evident. He was guiding me away from the comforting neon lights and bustling streets. Instead, we ventured deeper into the city's underbelly. Each turn took us further from familiarity and closer to the desolation of the old warehouse district, a testament to a time when industry thrived here. "Stop here." His voice broke the monotonous hum of the car's engine. Obediently, I pulled over next to an abandoned warehouse, its windows long shattered and walls scarred with graffiti. The heaviness of the situation pressed down on me. Summoning a voice that I hoped didn't betray my fear, I asked, "Why? Why me?" He leaned forward, the scant light from the dashboard revealing a face that had seen its share of battles. "I need something," he murmured. Panic swirled, laced with confusion. "What? Money? My wallet's in the glove compartment. Take it." A chuckle, cold and mirthless, slipped from his lips. "Not what? Who? But it seems there's been an error." The revelation didn't bring relief. It intensified the fear. An error? Then why am I here? "Unfortunately, you've seen me, and that's a problem." Time seemed to slow. My mind raced through scenarios, calculating the odds. The key was in the ignition, but would I have the time to start the car and speed away? He seemed agile, and the car's confined space was a disadvantage. But as the saying goes, desperate times call for desperate measures. Mustering all my strength and courage, I lunged at him, using my body weight to push him hard against the door. The unexpected move caught him off guard. Capitalizing on this momentary lapse, I flung the door open and bolted into the night. The warehouse district was unfamiliar territory, a daunting maze of derelict buildings and winding alleyways. However, fear proved to be a powerful compass. In the distance, the glow of neon lights beckoned, leading me to a 24-hour diner. Bursting through the door, I frantically explained my ordeal to the few patrons and staff, urging them to call the police. The subsequent hours were a blur of questions, statements, and identification parades. The stranger was indeed a notorious enforcer for one of the city's most dangerous gangs. He was known for his ruthlessness, delivering messages of intimidation or worse. The real twist? I was never his intended target. It was just a cruel twist of fate that my car model matched his actual objective for the evening. In the rotting heart of a once bustling city, cloaked by the grim pallor of permanent dust, stood Street Morgana's hospital, a fortress of suffering. The structure sprawled over several city blocks, windows like vacuous eyes gaping into the abyss of eternal night. I found myself trapped in this behemoth, a patient, not by choice but by cruel circumstance. Not remembering how or why I ended up here, just a vague awareness of a lurching ambulance ride, of masked figures moving in blurry synchrony, of screams that seemed to echo from the core of my own mind. Then abrupt silence, punctuated by the sporadic hum of dimmed, dying fluorescent lights. Days blended into nights, and the nights into nightmares, a ceaseless, undulating pattern of existence. Time had a way of distorting itself here, perhaps as some unspeakable cosmic joke. I was confined to my bed in a ward that was eternally shrouded in sterile half-light. Around me, the ward harbored an insidious tableau of shadow-shrouded figures who appeared to be other patients, each lost in their world of pain and silence, their features a canvas for dread and despair. Our ward was under the constant vigil of the nurses, spectral figures wrapped in once white uniforms, now stained with unknown horrors. Their faces were obscured beneath layers of masks and visors, eyes hidden behind tinted glasses. They moved with a mechanical precision, tending to us with hands as cold as the city's rain-slicked streets. They rarely spoke, except in hushed, garbled whispers that scratched at the edge of audibility. In the silence of the ward, interrupted only by the occasional groan of agony or the soft, wet coughs, the air became thick with the dread of the unknown, of death, and even worse, what lay beyond. A miasma of despair that tasted bitter on the tongue, almost corrupt. I heard whispers among the spectral nurses, a dread-filled word that I couldn't fully grasp, a word that sent shivers down my spine. Beyond the quarantine, the city seemed to be rotting away, collapsing under an invisible, insidious plague. The nurses never confirmed it, their cryptic silence doing more harm than any spoken word. They were our sole connection to the world outside. Yet they brought no news, no comfort, only a creeping sense of doom. I began to notice changes, aberrations in the hospital's reality. The coughing patients around me seemed to be caught in an endless loop of suffering, their pallid skin slowly peeling, revealing grotesque, blackened sores underneath. Their eyes, clouded and distant, flickered with an unholy light, the echo of an existence that was neither living nor dead. The nurses began to change too. Their precision slipped into erratic behavior. Their whispers grew more frantic, their movements more hurried. I noticed with a thrill of horror that they too bore the same blackened sores subtly hidden beneath their uniforms. One night, in the throes of a feverish stupor, I found myself staring into a reflective surface, the glass window of a passing medical cart. The face that stared back was not mine. It was an unrecognizable, decomposing shell of a person, eyes burning with that same unholy light. A gasp choked in my throat. I too was part of this grotesque tableau. Suddenly, everything fell into place, a terrifying puzzle, each piece more horrifying than the last. The coughing, the sores, the city's decay, our hospital quarantine, the nurses' frantic behavior, their whispers. It was a plague, a disease of undeath, of endless suffering, a reality worse. When I moved to the small town of Dunbridge, it was to escape the clamor of city life. The quaint houses, large oak trees, and welcoming neighbors felt like a breath of fresh air. I had bought a little bungalow on Hawthorne Street, working remotely for a renowned publishing house. The first month was an idyllic blur of settling in, taking long walks, and occasionally dining out at the town's solitary cafe. Then came the first gift, a simple white rose left on my doorstep. No note, no clue about the sender. I'd assumed it was a friendly gesture from a neighbor. Over the next week, roses started appearing every day. Along with them came letters, scribbled on crumpled paper. I admire your beauty from afar. Your hair dances like the golden rays of dawn. It was poetic but odd. My unease grew when roses started appearing not only at my doorstep, but also on my work desk at home. It meant someone was entering my house when I was out. I reported it to the local police. They promised increased patrols, but admitted that without any direct threats, their hands were tied. The letters became more intimate and possessive. One morning, I found a locket with a strand of my hair inside. The accompanying note read, "You and I are bound forever." I felt watched, stalked, trapped. Every creak in my house, every rustle outside made my heart race. Jenny, my colleague, suggested I stay with her. "Maybe your stalker will back off if he thinks you're not alone," she said. I agreed, needing the company and reassurance. One evening, after a particularly distressing day, we ordered food. The delivery guy was a tall man, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses. He seemed to linger a little too long, staring at me. I felt uneasy, but brushed it off. Weeks passed. The gifts and letters continued but became more spaced out. It seemed as if my unknown admirer had grown tired, or maybe the move to Jenny's had thrown him off. I decided to return home after a month. The first day was uneventful. As days passed, the paranoia returned. Every night, I double-checked my locks and windows, ensuring I was safe. One evening, after returning from the store, I found my living room light on. I was sure I turned it off. My heart thudded in my chest as I approached. The room was empty, but on the table lay a rose and a note. "I missed you." Panicking, I called the police. They searched the house, finding nothing. "Maybe you forgot to turn off the light," the officer suggested. They left, urging me to consider security cameras. The next day, I decided to install cameras inside and outside my home. That night, I reviewed the footage, hoping to catch a glimpse of the stalker. Hours of mundane recordings flashed by until my living room camera revealed something chilling. The delivery guy from that evening at Jenny's stood at my window peering in. He attempted to open it but failed. Then he looked directly into the camera, his cold eyes sending a shiver down my spine. The following morning, I showed the footage to the police. They identified him as Edward Hayes, a man previously suspected of stalking, but never prosecuted due to lack of evidence. They arrested Edward later that day. The subsequent search of his home revealed a shrine dedicated to me, with photos, some taken from afar, others from inside my house. I learned that Edward was infatuated with me after that one delivery to Jenny's. He thought we shared a bond. My house being close to the cafe, he saw me regularly, fueling his obsession. I was relieved but deeply shaken. The quiet town of Dunbridge was supposed to be my haven, not a place of terror. The experience changed me. I became more guarded, more wary. But I also grew stronger, learning that while horrors may lurk in unexpected places, I had the resilience and support to overcome them. Nestled in the heart of the Canadian wilderness, there was a remote sanctuary, isolated amidst the stoic mountain range and the unforgiving boreal forest. The desolate hotel, appropriately named the Frostbite, rose like a monolith against the harsh environment, a solitary beacon of human presence in the vast, unending expanse. It was this secluded hotel that I had selected for my retreat as I sought refuge from the clamorous world that throbbed outside my window. I am a middle-aged novelist, and the crippling noise and pace of urban life had worn me thin. A writer, I believe, thrives on silence and solitude, and the Frostbite, with its distant location and sparse clientele, seemed like the perfect haven. Each room was a cocoon, effectively soundproofed against the howling winds and the occasional murmurs of the neighboring guests. But there was one room adjacent to mine that held a sense of foreboding, room 303. It was the third day of my stay when I first noticed the man occupying room 303. He was a gaunt figure, an embodiment of profound grief, his eyes deep pools of desolation. He radiated an air of discomfort that sent ripples through my otherwise serene world, unsettling the calm surface of my solitude. In the days that followed, I noticed a chilling pattern. Late into the night, the man paced back and forth in his room, his footsteps echoing like a haunting symphony against the solid oak flooring. Sometimes, whispers of uncanny monologues escaped through the walls, punctuated by the unnerving sound of his laughter, disturbing the otherwise peaceful silence of the Frostbite. One evening, as I returned from a walk, a nauseating odor greeted me outside his door. It was a sickening amalgamation of metallic tang and decay, a scent that crawled into the nostrils and clung to the senses. The stench was so overwhelming that I found myself retching, my body rejecting the repugnant aroma with a visceral reaction. The very next day, I spotted him struggling to dispose of a large object, hastily concealed in a blood-stained sheet. His knuckles were white as they clung to the gruesome parcel, and a sheen of sweat covered his deathly pale face. Our eyes met, and a sudden chill seized me, an icy grip of terror that eclipsed all reason. That moment sparked an avalanche of dreadful thoughts. My mind was set ablaze with horrifying possibilities. The man's disturbing behavior, the repulsive smell, and the horrific parcel. The sinister puzzle pieces were falling into place, but I shrank from the picture they were forming. Resolute to confront him, I found myself standing before the door of room 303. My fist rose to knock but paused in midair. A wave of apprehension washed over me. I mustered my courage and rapped on the door. The sound echoed in the silence, unanswered. An eerie stillness hung in the air, sending shivers down my spine. My ear pressed against the cold door, straining for any sound, was met with an unsettling silence. Frantic, I sought the hotel manager. I relayed my concerns, my voice shaking as I recounted the peculiar behaviors of the man from room 303. The manager, a burly, pragmatic man, seemed skeptical but was swayed by my obvious distress. The door to room 303 creaked open under the careful hands of the manager, revealing a scene that was beyond any ghastly figment of my imagination. The room was a horrifying tableau, painted in varying shades of crimson. Centered in the room, splayed out grotesquely on the bed, lay the mutilated corpse of a wild boar. Its entrails were strewn around in a macabre display, the sight of which turned my stomach. The manager, ashen-faced, dialed the local authorities, his fingers trembling. I found myself leaning heavily against the wall, trying to reconcile the chilling scene with reality. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the silent accusation of the grotesque sight burned into my retinas. When the authorities arrived, their subsequent investigation unearthed a story that was more horrifying than the grisly scene itself. The man from room 303 was a renowned wildlife biologist suffering from severe psychosis. In his deranged state, he had hunted and killed the boar, deluded into believing that he was conducting groundbreaking scientific research. His insanity was revealed when he was found the next day, wandering aimlessly through the forest, repeating saving humanity in a crazy mantra. The hotel, the forest, the tranquility, everything was tainted with the residue of this terrifying episode. Late at night, the city was a sprawling concrete jungle with lights that twinkled like stars in an earthly firmament. Encased within this vast urban expanse was a series of apartment buildings. Apartment 27A, an austere residence occupying the 7th floor of an old, crumbling building, was my new abode. Recently divorced, I had moved in with the hope of starting anew. Little did I know of the macabre events that were to transpire. My first night, I remember being captivated by the panoramic view of the city from the living room window. The apartment across the street was at level with mine, a mirror image of my own solitude. I occasionally caught a glimpse of my neighbor, a stern man with a long, scarred face and unsettlingly cold blue eyes. He lived alone, as far as I could tell, and seldom turned the lights on. Something about him screamed oddity, but I brushed it off, attributing it to my heightened sense of apprehension. On a fateful Friday night, I found myself gazing out at the sleeping city. Suddenly, I saw a woman stepping into the apartment across mine. Her red dress was striking against the otherwise dreary backdrop. She had an enchanting smile, a stark contrast to my neighbor's icy demeanor. I saw them conversing, though I couldn't hear the dialogue. I was a silent observer, watching the scene unfold. Suddenly, the atmosphere changed. His stern face turned menacing, the smile on her face diminished. His hands began to move frantically, his voice seemed to be rising, and she backed away, fear apparent in her eyes. The next moment was a grotesque tableau. The man pulled out a shiny object from his pocket, a knife, gleaming under the harsh apartment lights. I gasped as I saw him lunge towards her, the fear in her eyes reflecting my own terror. The red of her dress turned a deeper shade, her screams soundless but palpable. I was paralyzed, a cold sensation of horror gripping my heart, but I had to act. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As I described the grim scene unfolding before my eyes, I heard the sirens approaching. I prayed they weren't too late. To my utter shock, the man, upon hearing the sirens, stumbled into his living room, blood staining his clothes. He looked directly at me, his cold, blue eyes meeting mine. My blood froze. His stare bore into me, sending a chill down my spine. He knew I had seen everything. The police arrived, finding the woman still alive but barely hanging on. The man, however, was nowhere to be found. I watched as they cordoned off the apartment and a medevac airlifted the woman to a hospital. Her hauntingly terrified eyes remained seared into my memory. The following days were filled with paranoia. Every knock, every phone ring sent a jolt of fear through me. I feared the man would return, but he never did. The police reassured me he had fled the city, but it did little to quell my fears. Several weeks later, I received news that the woman had survived. She was recovering, and her testimony had been instrumental in identifying her assailant, who was now on the most wanted list. Despite the unsettling events, there was an odd sense of relief. I felt a renewed sense of courage knowing that my actions had saved a life. That apartment across the street remained a chilling reminder of that night. The smell hit me first. Decades of rust and decay met with the pungent reminder of oils long dried and gears long seized. The mammoth, decaying industrial complex stood like a relic from a forgotten era, a chilling testament to the history of violence it had harbored. As a master mechanic with a soft spot for antique machinery, I, Jack Halsey, had made a career out of restoring old factories. But this factory had a sinister reputation. Everyone in the small town of Hanford would speak about it in hushed, trembling whispers. They said it was cursed, haunted by a psychopathic killer who made it his lair. One crisp June evening, I found myself staring at the monstrous structure, the dim twilight giving it an even more eerie outlook. The story was, the previous owners had hired some deranged ex-con for maintenance who, after being fired, swore bloody vengeance. They found bodies, gruesomely dismembered, strewed across the factory floors, some stuffed into rusty boilers or tossed into vats of chemicals. They never caught him, and the factory was abandoned. "Jack, don't go there," they said. But logic is a stubborn master. It was the perfect project to establish myself as the premier restoration mechanic in the region. Overriding my fear with ambition, I packed my toolbox, picked my courage, and stepped into the complex. The atmosphere inside was palpably dense, oppressive even. It felt as though the shadows themselves clung to me, seeping into my very pores. I descended into the factory's belly, every crunch of my boots on the gravelly floor echoing ominously. I tried to focus on the task at hand, examining the monstrous boilers, the twisted pipes, and the corroded machinery became a welcome distraction from the eerie silence. Then I heard it, the softest creak, a barely audible shuffle. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Was it just my imagination playing tricks? I spun around, flashlight in hand. Nothing. Shaking it off as paranoia, I continued my work. A blood-curdling scream sliced through the silence. It echoed in the vastness of the factory, bouncing off the cold metal walls, growing louder, intensifying. I felt the hairs on my neck stand as a shiver ran down my spine. The scream had come from deep within the factory. Panic started to creep in, wrapping its cold, skeletal fingers around my heart, but I couldn't let it consume me. Thinking on my feet, I rummaged through my toolbox, pulling out an old wrench. My palms were sweaty, but my grip was steady. I had to be resourceful, using the knowledge of the complex layout I gathered. I quietly moved, sticking to the shadows, my wrench my only ally in the cavernous factory. Another scream pierced the night, this one closer. My skin crawled as I peered around a rusty column to see a horrifying sight. A man, covered in grim and filth, was hunched over a makeshift operating table. His eyes held a twisted glint, a sickening smile etched on his face. A blood-soaked apron clung to his body as he hummed a haunting tune, relishing in the horrifying act. Fear bubbled inside me, the grotesque image etching itself into my mind. But there was no time for fear. Survival was paramount. I tried to remember the blueprints of the factory, looking for a way out. My hands shook, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Suddenly, the man turned his head. Our eyes met, a predatory glint flashing in his. Panic exploded within me, yet I had to maintain my composure. I took a deep breath, pulling together all my courage. I darted across the factory floor, his maniacal laughter echoing behind me. My heart pounded in my ears as I raced through the labyrinth of rusty machinery. I had to be smarter, faster, if I hoped to survive. I remembered a hidden exit in the blueprint, a forgotten chute used for discarding scrap. I sprinted towards the chute, praying it was operational. The killer was right behind me, his heavy footfalls matching my racing heartbeats. With a final surge of adrenaline, I jumped, sliding down the chute towards the uncertain darkness. The chute spit me out into the cold night. Panting heavily, I looked back at the decaying factory, its ominous silhouette against the moonlit sky. The night was pierced again by the maddening laughter, chilling me to the bone. I stumbled to my feet, sprinting away from the cursed complex. The experience was horrifying, leaving me shocked and traumatized. It was a grim reminder of the evil that can lurk in forgotten corners, within rusting metal and beneath peeling paint. Yet I survived. I used my wit, my skill, and sheer determination to escape the clutches of a psychopathic killer. I am Jack Halsey, the mechanic who lived to tell the tale of the cursed factory. But Hanford would forever remember it as the eerie legend of the corroded colossus. It was a Tuesday evening in Derby, Vermont, and Jacob Shaw, the town's gruff but well-liked sheriff, was finishing his shift. The night was a shroud of ink, only interrupted by a sliver of moon and the occasional blink of far-off stars. The town was so quiet, you could hear the icy wind whispering against the leaves, rustling stories of the past. One such story had been on Jacob's mind for weeks, an old Inuit legend his grandmother used to tell him about a malevolent spirit, a Wendigo, a soul-eater that was once human but transformed after a terrible act of cannibalism, driven by insurmountable hunger and harsh winter. The story had seemed just a folklore tale until a series of inexplicable occurrences began to shake the sleepy town of Derby. Livestock had been found gutted, bodies stripped to the bone, that remained scattered across Snow Street pastures. Then, people began disappearing, vanishing from their homes without a trace. The town was in a grip of fear, whispers of the Wendigos circling like a chilling breeze. Jacob wasn't one to believe in such myths, but the strange events had even him questioning his steadfast logic. He had found strange tracks near the sites of the attacks, human-like, but with elongated footprints, a haunting echo of a creature that should not exist. As he was about to head home, a frantic call came through his radio. "Sheriff, it's the Johnson farm. Something's there." He revved up his pickup and drove down the winding roads, the tires squealing against the frost-kissed asphalt. The Johnson farm was a sad sight. The fields lay barren and the once vibrant farmhouse now a decrepit husk. As he arrived, he saw Ed Johnson, the family's patriarch, outside holding a shotgun, his eyes wide with terror. His gaze was fixed on the barn. Inside, the scene was harrowing. The Johnsons' cattle were ripped apart, their bodies ravaged with an intense, savage hunger. But that wasn't what froze Jacob's blood. The Wendigo stood there, a horrific blend of beast and man. Its emaciated body towered over him, its skin stretched so tight over the skeletal frame that it seemed transparent. Its eyes, sunken deep in their sockets, burned with a baleful, unending hunger. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, blood-stained teeth, letting out a haunting wail that chilled Jacob's soul. Time seemed to stop. He could feel his heart pounding against his chest, his instincts screaming at him to flee. But he was the sheriff. He couldn't run. Pulling out his service revolver, he fired at the beast, the loud bang echoing in the barn. The bullets hit the Wendigo, but it barely flinched, the wounds on his body healing as quickly as they appeared. Its gaze never left Jacob, a predator locking onto his prey. Ed appeared at the barn door, his shotgun in hand. With a terrified yell, he unloaded both barrels at the Wendigo. But like before, the wounds healed almost instantly. The Wendigo turned its attention to Ed, and with a speed that belied its size, it lunged at him. "No!" Jacob cried out, but it was too late. The Wendigo was upon Ed, and then Ed was no more. Jacob, in desperation, remembered an old part of his grandmother's tale. "It feeds on flesh, but craves the soul," she used to say. "To defeat it, you must offer it a soul it cannot resist." In a bold, almost suicidal move, Jacob locked eyes with the Wendigo and opened his mind to the beast, inviting it into his soul. The Wendigo hesitated, its hunger-filled gaze faltered. For a moment, it seemed to human, a twisted mirror of what it once was. Then it lunged at Jacob. As the world around him faded, he felt an immense pain, but he held on, his mind tethered to the beast. They tumbled into a strange space, a battle of wills in the eerie darkness of the Wendigo's soul. Jacob saw its memories, its transformation, the countless lives it had taken. With a surge of determination, Jacob pushed back, his resolve becoming a beacon in the dark. He felt the Wendigo weaken, its hunger slowly fading. Then, with one final push, he severed the connection, returning to the physical world. He found himself back in the barn, the Wendigo gone. Ed was still dead, but the terror was over. The Wendigo was no more, but in its place, Jacob was left with a haunting memory, a piece of the creature forever etched into his soul. He had survived the Wendigo, but at what cost? As he stared at his hands, now trembling, he wondered whether he had defeated the beast or merely taken its place. The echoes of its hunger stirred within him. The town was safe, but the true horror, he realized, had just begun. The first hint that something was wrong came from the radio. Its tinny voice, usually the background hum to my deliveries, began crackling with urgency. Reports of mass protests, civil unrest, and violence painted a picture far removed from the tranquil early evening I had expected. As I approached the city's edge, my worn-out delivery van jutted over the cracked roads, and the sun began its descent, casting eerie shadows on the graffitied walls. The GPS indicated that my route was through the heart of the city. The thought weighed heavily on me, but I shrugged it off. After all, I had a job to complete. The scenes which greeted me downtown were beyond anything I had imagined. The city, always a buzzing hive of activity, had turned into a tempestuous sea of anger and chaos. The rioters' faces, contorted with rage, became clearer as I cautiously drove closer. Smoke billowed from burning cars, their crimson flames reflecting in my rear-view mirror, dancing like malevolent spirits. Streets that I had driven countless times, places filled with memories of casual conversations and regular customers, had transformed into war zones. I could hear screams, distant and then nearer, glass shattering, alarms wailing in protest. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. I had almost reached my destination when a large group blocked the road ahead, their faces hidden behind makeshift masks. I tried to reverse, but another group approached menacingly from behind, trapped. A tall, imposing figure broke away from the crowd and approached my window. "What's in the van?" he demanded. "Just some deliveries, man," I stammered, heart pounding against my ribs. Suddenly, the back doors of my van were yanked open. I heard rummaging, then a shriek. The figure at my window barked, "Everyone, back off." Confused, I turned to see a young woman no older than 20 emerging from the back of my van. She was one of the rioters, clutching one of the packages. "They're just books," she exclaimed, breathless, her voice echoing with disbelief. "It's all just books." The crowd was momentarily stunned. Then, almost as if the revelation had flipped a switch, the atmosphere changed. Faces softened. The tall man who'd initially approached me stepped forward. "I'm sorry," he muttered, extending a hand. "We thought you were carrying weapons or supplies for the police." The young woman handed back the package, her eyes now curious. "You're delivering books in the middle of this?" "They're for the children's hospital," I replied, the weight of the situation finally catching up with me, making my voice shake. "Stories for the kids who can't get out." Another man, older, with gray in his beard, stepped forward. "We'll escort you there," he said decisively, the earlier chaos seemingly forgotten. With their protection, my journey through the riot-torn city became eerily calm. The rioters cleared paths, and others joined our convoy, ensuring my safe passage. Arriving at the hospital, the children's wing was a haven of peace amid the chaos outside. As I unloaded the books, the initial group of rioters joined in, helping distribute them to eager young hands. The tall man, once so menacing, knelt by a young girl's bed, animatedly reading to her from a fairy tale book. The transformation was astounding. Returning to my van, the older man with the gray beard approached. "It's not safe out there. Stay here for the night," he urged. As I settled into the makeshift refuge, surrounded by the comforting hum of children engrossed in their tales, the city outside continued its tumultuous dance. But in that one corner, stories, not violence, ruled the night. The next morning, the sun's first rays pierced through the smoky haze. With a heavy heart, I resumed my journey. The rioting had subsided, but its scars remained. The difference, though, was the message I carried. Even in our darkest moments, hope can light the way. In the darkest corners of a sprawling urban metropolis, a solitary taxicab flickered like an anguished specter under the nocturnal glow of fading neon lights. The city, a grotesque monstrosity of civilization, roared in a cacophony of despair and hedonism. Amidst this urban pandemonium, a young traveler, Alice, emerged. Alice, a woman of no more than 22, was fresh off the boat, an alien in this unfamiliar urban jungle. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of naivety and excitement, glanced around, taking in the city's sensory assault. The nauseating stench of rotting trash, the glaring lights, the shadowy alleyways that threatened to swallow her whole, it all felt intoxicating yet terrifying. Eager to escape, she hailed the nearest taxi, a battered vehicle that creaked with age. Its yellow paint was peeling off like a reptile shedding its skin, and its lone headlight glared menacingly into the night. Alice clambered inside, sliding onto the worn leather seats, the scent of stale smoke enveloping her. The driver, a middle-aged man with a face prematurely wrinkled by harsh city life, gave her a crooked smile in the rear-view mirror, his eyes, dull and lifeless, locked onto hers for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Where to, love?" he rasped. "Ashwood Hotel, downtown," Alice replied, her voice shaking slightly. The driver nodded, his smile never wavering, and then they were off, the taxi disappearing into the city's concrete veins. As the ride progressed, Alice noticed the taxi was not heading towards the main streets that bustled with activity, but into the grimy back alleys that reeked of urine and despair. The driver, humming an off-key tune, didn't seem to notice her discomfort, or if he did, he chose to ignore it. The eerie tune, combined with his strange behavior and the dubious route, set Alice's heart racing. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry as she asked, "Are you sure this is the right way?" "Shortcut, love." "Don't worry," he replied, his voice like gravel. Alice tried to push away the gnawing fear, telling herself it was only her overactive imagination. But when the cab swerved into a deserted industrial area, her heart pounded relentlessly against her rib cage. Abandoned warehouses, their windows like dark, soulless eyes, glared at her. She reached for her phone, but her fingers, slick with cold sweat, slipped. Suddenly, the cab screeched to a halt. The driver, his face now concealed in the shadows, grunted, "End of the line, love." Terror choked her, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "This isn't Ashwood Hotel," she protested weakly. "No, it's not," the driver replied, his voice an emotionless drone. But just as Alice's fear spiked into sheer terror, the driver unexpectedly began laughing, his laughter a hoarse, guttural sound that echoed through the cab. "Look at your face, love. I'm just messing with you. Your hotel is just around the corner." As if on cue, the taxi pulled around a corner, and there it was, the Ashwood Hotel, a beacon of safety in this alien city. The driver was still laughing as Alice paid the fare and practically bolted from the cab, the man's laughter still echoing in her ears. Her heart pounding and her body trembling with adrenaline, Alice finally sighed with relief. It had been a horrific journey, but she had arrived safely. Her initial terror was now replaced by an indignant fury. As she stomped towards the hotel lobby, she made a mental note to report the driver in the morning. It had been a nightmarish detour, but at least it had ended happily. This beach has been my haven for as long as I can recall, a hallowed ground where the whisper of waves harmonized with the soothing rustle of palms. The azure of the ocean blending with the pristine white sand created an image so picturesque, so serene, it felt like an illusion spun by Mother Nature herself. But lately, a sinister ripple had begun to distort this idyllic portrait. A malignant entity lurked beneath the placid surface, an unseen specter that sent a shiver down my sun-kissed skin. Its presence was an anomaly, a discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. An inexplicable paranoia gripped me, a nagging sensation of being surveyed by unseen eyes. Every time my gaze meandered towards the cobalt expanse of the sea, a shadow darted at the corner of my vision, playing tricks on my mind. Yet when I attempted to confront this elusive phantom, all I was met with was the serene, deceptive innocence of the ocean. Despite my attempts to rationalize it, to chide myself for entertaining flights of fancy, an unsettling premonition lingered. The depths of these familiar waters seemed to harbor an unknown menace, a lurking danger that echoed tales of deadly predators, of the great white sharks that were the undisputed rulers of these waters, and my mind began to weave horrifying scenarios. A lone surfer in this grandeur of the ocean, the exhilarating solitude of my pastime now felt like a dangerous dalliance with fate. My trusty surfboard, once my stalwart companion, seemed a laughable defense against the unseen titan beneath the waves. Despite the tumult in my mind, I decided to brave the waves. I paddled out to the lineup, the burgeoning waves a reflection of the adrenaline-fueled excitement churning in my veins. My heart hammered in my chest, beating a rhythm of thrill and fear as I waited for the perfect wave. When the colossal swell finally made its appearance, I didn't hesitate. Dropping in, I surrendered to the pure ecstasy of the ride. The sensation was transcendent, an intoxicating cocktail of adrenaline and joy that blurred the world around me into insignificance. For a fleeting moment, the ominous specter of danger was forgotten. But such illusions of peace were short-lived. In the midst of my exhilaration, a sinister sight yanked me back into stark reality. Something vast and shadowy shifted beneath the sun-dappled water. Fear gripped my heart as I forced my eyes to confirm what my instincts were screaming. There, barely a few feet away, loomed the monstrous embodiment of my nightmares, a great white shark. Its size was awe-inspiring, a grotesque spectacle of nature's lethal craftsmanship. Its unblinking gaze fixed upon me with chilling intent. Time seemed to freeze as the beast lunged, its cavernous maw gaping wide to reveal row upon row of serrated teeth. A horrified scream was torn from my throat as its jaws clamped down on my board, the dreadful sound of cracking fiberglass echoing my own doom. Desperately, I attempted to flee, but the monstrous strength of the shark easily overpowered me. The world tipped over as I was dragged under, the cold reality of my impending doom setting in with every scrape of its abrasive teeth against my skin. Yet, in this tableau of terror, a beacon of hope manifested. A pod of dolphins, a cavalry of silhouettes, raced towards the unfolding nightmare. They bombarded the shark with coordinated attacks, their sleek bodies a flurry of torpedoes in the murky water. Overwhelmed and outnumbered, the great white was forced to retreat, its reign of terror ended by the unexpected defenders. Exhausted and in shock, I managed to paddle my way back to shore. Collapsing onto the sand, my heart pounded in my chest, the terrifying ordeal replaying in my mind over and over. This beach, my refuge, had now become the stage of a horrifying dance with death. The sun began to set, casting long, foreboding shadows that seemed to mock my survival. I had learned a lesson today, a lesson birthed from terror and sealed with adrenaline. The thrill of solitary surfing, no matter how enticing, was a risk too great. As the moon began its nocturnal vigil and the haunting hush of the night wrapped itself around me, I made a silent vow. Never again would I challenge fate and venture alone into the deceptive embrace of these azure waters. She was about to fall asleep on the couch when the phone rang. It was past midnight, and she had just finished a long shift at the diner. She groaned and reached for the cordless phone on the coffee table. "Hello," she said, rubbing her eyes. There was no answer, only a deep, unsettling silence. She frowned and checked the caller ID. It was blocked. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice quivering slightly. Still, there was no response, just an eerie static noise. She hung up and tossed the phone back on the table, feeling a growing unease in the pit of her stomach. She couldn't shake off the chilling sensation that something was terribly wrong. She closed her eyes and tried to ignore her rising fear. But then the phone rang again. Her heart skipped a beat, and a shiver ran down her spine. She opened her eyes and glared at the phone, dreading the thought of answering it. However, her curiosity and mounting anxiety got the better of her. With trembling hands, she picked it up and pressed the talk button. "Listen, you sicko. If you don't stop this right now, I swear I'll..." Before she could finish her threat, she was interrupted by a low, sinister chuckle. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. This wasn't a prank call anymore. This was something far more sinister. "What do you want?" she managed to utter, her voice barely audible. The breathing on the other end became heavier, louder, and filled with malice. "I can see you," a chilling voice whispered. "I know what you're wearing. I know where you live. You can't hide from me." A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She glanced nervously around the room, feeling a sudden vulnerability in her own home. Every shadow seemed to come alive with lurking danger. Summoning her courage, she mustered a shaky voice. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" But the only response she received was a sinister, bone-chilling laugh that echoed through the receiver, seeping deep into her soul. Terrified, she dropped the phone and rushed to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She desperately pulled the curtains shut, as if shutting out the unseen presence that threatened her sanity. Frantically, she dialed 911, her voice trembling as she recounted the events to the operator. The seconds felt like hours as she waited for help to arrive, her ears hyper-aware of every creak and whisper in her apartment. Finally, she heard a knock on the door. Her body tensed, and her breath caught in her throat. Was it the police, or was it the tormentor at her doorstep? "Who is it?" she whispered, her voice filled with apprehension. "It's me, Mike," a voice replied from the other side. "Something's not right. I heard your scream. Are you okay?" Relief washed over her like a balm. Mike was her neighbor, a dependable presence in her life. But even with his familiar voice, a lingering doubt remained. Could she truly trust anyone? She cautiously opened the door, peering into the dimly lit hallway. Mike stood there, his features distorted by the shadows. In his hand, a flashlight illuminated his concerned face. "I'm here, Lisa. What's happening?" he asked, his voice full of genuine concern. She rushed into his arms, trembling and on the verge of tears. "There's someone. They've been calling me, watching me. They know things, personal things." Mike's expression hardened, and he entered her apartment with determination. "Stay behind me, Lisa. I won't let anyone harm you." As he searched the apartment, the tension in the air thickened, each room becoming a potential hiding place for the deranged stalker. Lisa's pulse raced, her senses heightened to an almost painful level. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a shadow, felt like a malicious presence closing in. But to her astonishment, Mike found no trace of an intruder. The emptiness of the apartment only deepened her sense of dread. Was this all in her mind, or was the stalker cunningly evading detection? As Mike returned to her side, she looked up at him, her eyes pleading for answers and reassurance. His face seemed sincere, yet a flicker of something darker passed through his gaze. "Don't worry, Lisa," he whispered, his voice laced with an unsettling mix of sympathy and malevolence. "You're safe now. No one can harm you." Her fear renewed. Lisa took a step back, her mind racing with suspicion. She clutched the phone tightly, ready to call for help again. But before she could react, Mike's smile vanished, and his expression contorted into a twisted grin. Revealing his true intentions, he held up the cell phone and pressed a button. In a bone-chilling whisper, he uttered words that froze Lisa's blood. "I can see you." In the depths of a moonlit forest, where the canopy of ancient trees swayed with an eerie creak, I found myself venturing deeper into the heart of darkness. The dense undergrowth clawed at my clothes, leaving tattered shreds of fabric in its wake. Fear coiled around my heart like a vise, and a shiver ran down my spine as the full moon cast its pale glow upon the desolate landscape. I had come to this forsaken place for one reason alone, a reason that gnawed at the edges of my sanity with every passing day: the fear of becoming a monster. My name is Emily Sinclair, and I am a tormented loner, haunted by the whispers of the past and the shadows that danced in the recesses of my mind. I sought solace in the wilderness, hoping to find answers to the questions that plagued me. The night air was heavy with an otherworldly stillness, broken only by the distant howl of a wolf, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurked in the darkness. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the trees closed in around me, their gnarled branches intertwining like bony fingers, creating an oppressive atmosphere. The ground beneath my feet grew moist and spongy, the stench of decay permeating the air. Strange, phosphorescent mushrooms sprouted from the decaying undergrowth, casting an ethereal glow upon the forest floor. Their sickly green light illuminated grotesque shapes, shadows that seemed to shift and writhe with a life of their own. A frisson of unease ran through me as I realized that I was now alone. Eyes, gleaming with feral hunger, glinted in the darkness. The forest was alive with unseen creatures, their presence a constant reminder of the tenuous hold I had on my own humanity. Paranoia gripped me, the feeling that I was being watched, hunted, becoming too difficult to dismiss. With each passing moment, the forest seemed to change, morphing into a twisted reflection of my fears. The trees contorted into monstrous shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal limbs, ready to ensnare me. The ground writhed with a carpet of slithering creatures, their grotesque forms blending into the night. I stumbled, my breath coming in ragged gasps, as the forest closed in around me. And then I heard it, the low, guttural growl that sent chills coursing through my veins. It was a sound that spoke of feral instincts, of an unbridled hunger that could not be sated. I turned, my eyes widening in horror as I beheld the creature before me, a werewolf, its massive form silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Its eyes, burning with an unholy fire, locked onto mine, and a surge of primal fear coursed through my veins. The werewolf lunged, its snarling jaws dripping with saliva, and I ran. I ran as if my life depended on it, as if the very essence of my being was at stake. But the forest seemed to conspire against me, the trees closing ranks, trapping me in a nightmarish maze. I stumbled, my legs entangled in the undergrowth, and I fell to the ground. The werewolf closed in, its hot breath on my neck, its claws digging into my flesh. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable, for the transformation that would turn me into a monster, but it never came. I opened my eyes to find the forest bathed in the soft light of dawn. The werewolf was gone, leaving no trace of his presence except for the scars on my body. I had survived, but the fear still lingered, the fear of what I might become. And as I limped out of that cursed forest, I knew that the battle was not over. The darkness within me still loomed, waiting to be unleashed. For in that forest, I had come face to face with the true nature of fear, the fear of becoming the very monster I had sought to escape. And now, with every full moon that graced the night sky, I would forever be haunted by the possibility that one day I might succumb to the darkness and lose myself entirely. There was a long pause. We could hear our collective hearts beating rapidly. Paranoia set in. Was he truly lost, or was there something more sinister at play? Mia, the most pragmatic of us, asked, "How did you find this place?" He hesitated, then replied, "I was hiking. Got lost. Saw the lights." Something about his response didn't sit right. It was too vague, too rehearsed. The conversation was cut short when we heard a rustling behind him. To our horror, more figures emerged from the woods, all with the same hooded appearance. Fear gripped me. We were outnumbered. Peter, thinking quickly, grabbed a log from the fireplace, its flames licking the air. "Stay back," he shouted. The hooded man looked at his companions, then back at us. His gaze softened. "We didn't mean to frighten you. We're hikers. We got caught in an unexpected storm, lost our way. We saw the light from your cabin." Relief washed over me. The situation seemed less threatening now. After a quick discussion, we decided to let them stay in the barn a little distance away from the cabin. As dawn approached, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. I peered out of the window. The barn was empty, and the hikers were gone. Curiosity got the best of me, and I went to inspect the barn. What I found inside wasn't sinister but puzzling. Spread across the floor were a multitude of wildflowers arranged in beautiful, intricate patterns. In the middle, there was an aged leather journal. The journal was a memoir of a man named Jonathan who had lived during the early 1900s. He had built the very cabin we were staying in as a tribute to his late wife, Ilara. The entry spoke of his profound love for her and how he built the cabin as a place for them to cherish their memories. Ilara loved wildflowers, and he would often create patterns with them to make her smile. The last entry was dated 2 days before our visit. It read, "To whoever finds this, we are the descendants of Jonathan. We return every year to pay tribute to our great-grandmother Ilara. The patterns are for her. We meant no harm and only wanted to honor the love story that unfolded in this very cabin. We apologize if we scared you, but some traditions are too precious to give up." The realization that we had been part of a century-old ritual was both eerie and beautiful. We left the cabin later that day, leaving the wildflower patterns undisturbed, a silent acknowledgement of Jonathan and Ilara's timeless love. The cabin was a masterpiece of solitude. Nestled deep within the dense pine forest, it was a world away from the bustling streets of our college town, the perfect retreat for my friends and I, a place where we could forget about exams, deadlines, and responsibilities. As I looked out from the front porch, the setting sun cast long shadows over the undulating landscape. The vibrant hues of twilight painted the sky, juxtaposing against the dark silhouette of the trees. It was our first evening there, and the serenity of it all was almost intoxicating. Inside, Sarah was preparing dinner while Peter and Mia were entangled in a fierce battle of card games. Laughter echoed through the walls, creating a warm, homely feeling. Night had fallen by the time we sat down for dinner. The cabin was illuminated by soft candlelight and the flickering flames from the fireplace. With our bellies full and spirits high, we settled into the living room for some light-hearted conversation. That's when it happened. A soft, hesitant knock on the cabin door. We looked at each other, a hint of confusion evident in our eyes. "Who could that be?" Sarah whispered. There was no reason anyone should be here. We were miles away from civilization, and I hadn't told anyone about this place apart from the group. I rose from my chair, caution pushing my feet towards the door. Every footstep felt heavier than the last, with anticipation building inside of me. The wooden floorboards creaked under my weight, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. I peered through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. "Who is it?" I asked, trying to hide the tremble in my voice. There was no response. I considered opening the door, but a heavy hand rested on my shoulder. "Let's just ignore it. Might be some wild animal or the wind," Peter whispered. His brave facade couldn't hide the unease in his eyes. But the knock came again, louder this time. More persistent. There was a sense of urgency, a desperate need. I reached for the doorknob, but Maya stopped me. "Let's look through the window first," she said. We moved to the window, peeling the curtain back just a fraction. To our horror, a man stood at our doorstep, his face hidden by a hood. He looked lost, his clothes tattered and torn. He didn't knock again, but we could see he was muttering something to himself, a constant eerie chant that we couldn't quite decipher. Sarah, ever the kind-hearted one among us, suggested we at least ask if he needed help. He could be lost or hurt, she reasoned. Against my better judgment, I opened the door just a crack. "Can we help you?" I asked. The man looked up, revealing deep-set eyes that carried tales of sorrow. "I'm lost," he whispered. "I need shelter for the night. I promise I'll leave by dawn." It was a quiet suburban neighborhood at night, and a cautious college student named Emily was returning home for the holidays. The winter air was chilly, and a light mist hung in the air, creating an eerie atmosphere. As she walked down the dimly lit street, she couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Glancing over her shoulder, she noticed a figure lurking in the shadows, just a few steps behind her. Her heart skipped a beat, and a shiver ran down her spine. Emily quickened her pace, trying to dismiss her growing unease. But no matter how fast she walked, the stranger seemed to match her every step. Panic began to set in as she realized that this was no mere coincidence. She decided to confront him, summoning every ounce of courage she had left. Turning around abruptly, she locked eyes with the stranger. His piercing gaze sent a chill down her spine. With a sinister smile, he whispered in her ear, "I've been watching you for weeks." Emily's blood ran cold as she spun around, ready to confront her stalker, but he had vanished into thin air. She looked around frantically, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no sign of him anywhere. Was she losing her mind? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being toyed with, trapped in a twisted game. Days turned into weeks, and Emily's fear grew with each passing moment. Every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of leaves outside her window made her jump. She was on constant edge, haunted by the memory of the stranger's haunting whispers. Desperate for help, she confided in her friends and family, hoping they would believe her and offer some solace. But their dismissive responses only deepened her isolation. One night, after attending a party with her friends, Emily found herself walking home alone. The streets were deserted, and the night seemed unusually silent. As she neared her house, a shadow emerged from the darkness. It was him, the stranger who had tormented her for weeks. This time, he held a gleaming knife in his hand. A scream escaped Emily's lips as she turned and sprinted with all her might. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out the sound of her heavy breathing. But the stranger was relentless, his footsteps closing in on her with terrifying speed. She knew she had to find help, or else she would become another victim. Just when Emily felt her legs giving way, she saw a flickering light in the distance. Relief flooded over her as she realized it was a police car, sirens blaring, racing towards her. With renewed hope, she pushed herself harder, urging her tired muscles to keep going. The stranger's heavy breathing grew more distant as he realized the police were closing in. The police car screeched to a halt, and two officers emerged, their expressions a mix of concern and determination. Emily collapsed into their arms, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. She pointed in the direction the stranger had fled, desperately trying to convey the danger she had faced. The officers radioed for backup and reassured Emily that she was safe now. They quickly spread out, searching the area for any trace of the stalker. Meanwhile, they escorted Emily to the safety of their patrol car and called for an ambulance to tend to her physical and emotional wounds. In the days that followed, the police conducted a thorough investigation, dedicating themselves to bringing the stalker to justice. They enlisted the help of forensic experts, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed any evidence that could lead to his capture. Eventually, their efforts paid off. The stalker, identified as a known offender with a history of stalking and harassment, was apprehended. Emily received the news with a mix of relief and lingering trauma. Knowing that her ordeal had come to an end brought her a sense of closure, but she knew the road to recovery would be long. Emily sought professional help to overcome the deep scars left by her harrowing experience. With the support of her loved ones and therapists, she gradually regained her sense of security and rebuilt her life. She became an advocate for victims of stalking, sharing her story to raise awareness and empower others to speak out against such heinous acts. The first hint of turbulence started when I was dozing off. The gentle rocking of the aircraft had lulled me into a state of relaxation, despite the thick sense of dread I had felt earlier. The flight had been smooth over the vast oceans, but as we approached the rugged mountain range, I knew things would change. I've always hated flying. Call it a phobia or just plain irrational fear. For as long as I can remember, I've been terrified of the idea of being 30,000 feet in the air. But being a businessman, I often didn't have the luxury of choosing an alternative. This flight was no exception. A last-minute meeting, a client I couldn't say no to, and a presentation that couldn't wait had landed me in seat 21A. A sudden jolt brought me back to reality. The plane lurched violently, causing the overhead bins to rattle. As I clutched my armrests, trying to steady myself, the soothing voice of the captain echoed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing some turbulence due to our flight over a mountainous region. Please remain seated and ensure your seatbelts are fastened. The cabin lights dimmed, adding to the eeriness. I looked out of the window, searching for some semblance of the ground. Instead, a dense layer of fog surrounded us, blocking any view of the landscape below. It was like we were floating in a realm of obscurity, disconnected from the world. The man sitting beside me seemed calm. Dressed in a charcoal suit, he looked around the age of 50, with peppered hair and a calculating gaze. He noticed my distress and leaned over. First time over the mountains? I nodded, gulping down my anxiety. It's not the mountains. I've always been terrified of flying. He smiled, but it wasn't comforting. Instead, there was a cold, distant look in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. You know, he began in a whisper, sometimes it's not the flight you should be afraid of. It's the people on it. Before I could respond, the plane shook violently again. Overhead, the seatbelt sign flashed, and the flight attendants hurriedly strapped themselves in. Every cell in my body was screaming, telling me that something was gravely wrong. In the midst of the chaos, the man beside me reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, black device. It was square with a blinking red light. My heart raced faster, realizing the implication of what I was seeing. Beautiful, isn't it? He whispered, holding it up to the dim cabin light. One push of a button, and all our worries end. I was frozen in fear, my voice trapped in my throat. Was this a hijacking? Was this the end? Sensing my panic, he leaned closer. What's more terrifying? The unpredictability of this flight, or the knowledge that one person has the power to end it all? I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage. What do you want? I stammered. He smirked, pressing the device into my hand. Your choice. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. My mind raced, evaluating every possible outcome. The plane continued to shudder, and the reality of the situation settled in. I was being tested. Time's ticking, he whispered. Summoning my strength, I stood up, holding the device high for everyone to see. There's a man here with a bomb, I yelled. Within seconds, 2 air marshals tackled the man, restraining him and confiscating the device. As they dragged him away, his eerie laughter echoed through the cabin, sending shivers down my spine. The plane soon stabilized and the captain's voice came on again, this time with an added relief. Ladies and gentlemen, we've passed through the turbulent area and are approaching our destination. Thank you for your cooperation. The rest of the flight was a blur. Upon landing, I was met by a swarm of security personnel and investigators, all wanting to know about the man and the device. To everyone's shock, the device turned out to be a harmless decoy. The man, as I later learned, was a disgruntled ex-employee of the airline, aiming to spread fear rather than actual harm. The rhythmic hum of tires on the highway and the mellow croon of a late-night radio show was the only solace I found as I drove back from a friend's party. The evening was late, and a light fog danced over the road, adding an eeriness to the already dim night. The party had been a last-minute decision, and in retrospect, maybe not the best one. I was exhausted, the events of the night playing like a repetitive montage in my mind. Highway 56 was notorious for being desolate, especially this late. However, a blinding flash of red and blue lights broke my reverie. My heart started racing as the police siren wailed behind me. Cursing under my breath, I wondered if I had maybe been driving too fast without realizing. I pulled over, fingers trembling slightly. Though I hadn't had a drink at the party, the sudden appearance of a cop had my nerves spiking. Peering in the rearview mirror, I watched as a tall figure stepped out of the police cruiser, the fog swirling around his boots. There was something immediately off about him. The uniform was not like the ones I'd seen on other officers. It seemed slightly baggy, and his badge, even from this distance, looked tarnished. My paranoia began to grow when I noticed that his police cruiser lacked the typical markings. As he approached my window, the dim light illuminated a rough-looking face, hidden partly behind an unkempt beard. "Evening, ma'am," he grunted, his voice gravelly. "License and registration, please." While I complied, I couldn't help but notice his eyes, cold, devoid of the typical professional warmth you'd expect. There was something predatory about them. The radio on his shoulder didn't emit any typical police chatter. "Why did you pull me over, officer?" I managed, trying to keep my voice steady. He took his time, examining my papers. "You seem to swerve a little back there. Have you been drinking tonight?" I shook my head quickly. "No, sir, just tired." He peered into the back of the car, his gaze lingering longer than I was comfortable with. "All alone tonight?" The very question sent shivers down my spine. "My boyfriend's expecting me," I lied, hoping to deter any ideas he might have. He leaned in closer, the faint smell of stale cigarettes assaulting my nostrils. "You should be careful, driving this late. It's not safe for a young woman like you." Despite my rising fear, my instincts kicked in. "Thank you, officer. I'll be sure to remember that. Can I go now?" He took a long pause, then finally handed back my papers. "Drive safe," he murmured, but there was no concern in his voice, just an underlying threat. The instant he walked away, I sped off, not caring about any speed limits. My heart raced, and the fog seemed thicker, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. About 10 minutes later, another blinding flash of lights filled my mirrors, the same red and blue. Panic flooded me. I dialed 911 on my phone, keeping it on speaker. 911, what's your emergency? "I think I'm being followed by a fake cop on Highway 56. He pulled me over once, and now he's behind me again." My voice was on the edge of hysteria. The operator's voice was calm. "Stay on the line. We're tracking your location. We don't have any units dispatched in that area." The words felt like a punch in the gut. The siren wailed louder, and the cruiser edged closer. "Take the next turn off," the operator said. "It should be a rest area in about 2 miles. We'll have officers waiting for you there." Every second felt like an hour. I pushed my car faster, praying the rest area would appear. Just as despair threatened to engulf me, I saw the sign. As I turned off, I saw 2 police cruisers waiting. The fake cop's car screeched to a halt behind me, but he didn't get out. After what felt like an eternity, the 2 real officers approached my car. "You're safe now," one of them said, his face filled with genuine concern. It took months to shake off the paranoia. But the one thing that haunted me the most was the realization that if I hadn't trusted my instincts and called for help, I might not have made it home that night. The world is a remarkably simple place when you're 5. Friends are made effortlessly, and loyalty isn't dependent on anything beyond the mutual love of some toy or TV show. So when my daughter Sarah first mentioned her new friend Tommy, I didn't think much of it. Imaginary friends are standard fare at her age, and it was healthy for her imagination. The first time I noticed something unusual was on a chilly Sunday evening. As I walked past Sarah's room, I heard her giggling. The sound of a child's laugh can be the most comforting thing, but this felt different, more secretive. I softly peeked into her room. She was sitting in a circle of toys, whispering. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" I inquired. She looked up, her eyes wide and innocent. "Tommy." I smiled. "What were you two whispering about?" Sarah glanced to her side, as if waiting for Tommy's permission to tell. "He just tells me stories, Daddy, about the outside world. He says he has been everywhere." I chuckled. "Sounds like a very adventurous friend." Things took a strange turn a few days later when I found her in the backyard, talking animatedly to a bush. When I asked her what she was doing, she claimed Tommy lived there. I just put it down to her vibrant imagination. It wasn't until she started revealing things she couldn't possibly know that the unease began. Sarah started sharing detailed accounts of places she'd never been. She mentioned a small toy shop in a town we'd never visited, a park with a blue and yellow swing set in another state, and an ice cream parlor where Tommy met another friend. Curious and admittedly a little concerned, I started looking up these places. To my shock, they all existed, exactly as Sarah described. As days passed, I began hearing hushed conversations late at night, long after Sarah should have been asleep. She talked about more places, more experiences, and about some man, a man Tommy was afraid of. One night, as I was getting water from the kitchen, I heard Sarah's voice from the living room. It was past her bedtime. I tiptoed to see who she was talking to. From my vantage, I saw her in dim light, holding hands with a tall, gaunt figure. The sight made my blood turn cold. Who was this? Gathering courage, I yelled, "Who are you?" The figure bolted out the back door. Sarah, startled, began crying. I ran to her, holding her tight, and called the police. The following investigation unraveled a series of horrifying truths. The man had been a drifter, traveling from town to town, using an intricate network of small underground spaces linked to our house. He befriended children, get close, learn their schedules, their lives. He had done it multiple times in different states, and now he was in our home, whispering stories of his travels through a vent in Sarah's room. The backyard bush? It concealed an entrance to his hideout. As for Tommy, the police found a set of old children's clothes in his underground lair, along with a diary detailing his travels. The last entry spoke of befriending a little boy named Tommy, who went missing in another state. The man was captured a week later, trying to enter another home in a neighboring state. Our family moved out of that house, trying to leave behind the shadows of that horrifying encounter. Sarah went to therapy, and over time, the whispers of Tommy faded. One evening in our new home, as we sat down for dinner, she looked at me and said, "Daddy, Tommy says thank you. He says he can rest now." I hugged her tight. The rain poured heavily outside, the rhythmic patter providing a strange sense of solace. I found myself at Latz and Literature, my favorite coffee shop, clutching a steaming mug of cappuccino between my hands. The old mahogany bookshelves around the room, filled with vintage titles, always reminded me of the library I worked in. The ambience, the scent of old books, and the hum of whispered conversations made me feel safe. I had agreed to meet Kevin, my childhood friend, after years of no contact. We drifted apart after college, life taking us in different directions. A message out of the blue from him had caught me off guard. He said he needed to talk, that he had something to confess. My curious nature, coupled with my trusting disposition, urged me to accept his invitation. He looked different, not just older, but wearier. His once bright blue eyes now looked haunted, constantly darting around, never meeting mine. His fingers kept tapping nervously on the table. "Lucia," he began, swallowing hard, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I did." My heart raced. Was he in trouble? Did he need money? I hoped I could help, despite the growing sense of unease. "It's about Amelia." His voice cracked. Amelia was a common friend from our college days, someone I hadn't thought about in years. A rush of memories came flooding back, the three of us laughing, studying, and celebrating together. But the last time I saw Amelia was the night of our graduation party. She left early, and no one had seen or heard from her since. "What about Amelia, Kevin?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He gulped down his coffee as if trying to wash away the guilt. I was the last one to see her that night. I blinked, waiting for him to continue. "We had an argument near the old boathouse. I was angry, drunk, and things got out of hand. Before I knew it, she was lying motionless on the ground. I felt the blood drain from my face. The cozy coffee shop seemed to close in around me, the whispers of other patrons growing louder, distorted. She was gone, Lucia, and I panicked. I hit her. Every logical fiber in my being screamed to get away from Kevin, to run and inform the police. But my trusting nature, the history we shared, held me in place. "Have you told anyone else?" I asked, my voice barely audible. His gaze fixed on me. "No, only you. I thought you'd understand." Understand? Understand that he'd taken a life and kept it a secret for over a decade. My mind raced. What was my next step? Before I could think further, Kevin's cold hand clamped over mine. "You won't tell anyone, will you? Please, Lucia." I nodded slowly, struggling to mask my horror, trying to buy time. "I need to process this, Kevin." He seemed to relax a bit, releasing my hand. "Thank you. I knew I could trust you." Our meeting was a blur after that. I made some excuse about needing to leave early and practically fled from the coffee shop. I struggled with my conscience that night. Sleep was elusive. The weight of the confession bore down on me and paranoia took hold. Would he come after me if he thought I'd tell? Would I become his next victim? The next morning, I went to the police station and recounted our conversation. Within hours, they'd arrested Kevin. Amelia's remains were found shortly after, near the old boathouse. The trial was quick, the evidence against Kevin damning. As he was led away, his once vibrant blue eyes met mine. They were full of betrayal. But it wasn't me who betrayed him, it was his own guilt. In the aftermath, I struggled with trust. My innate tendency to believe in the good of people was shattered. However, time heals. Slowly, with therapy and the support of loved ones, I began to rebuild my life, my beliefs. Yet, every time I pass Latson literature, a shiver runs down my spine, reminding me of that rainy day when my world changed forever. The sun was barely a thin line on the horizon when John Weaver, an archaeologist of some renown, found himself standing on the edge of what he could only describe as an abyss. His team had been digging in the frozen tundra of northern Alaska for months, uncovering remnants of a long-lost civilization. But this yawning chasm was unlike anything they'd discovered before. An unending darkness seemed to stretch into its depths, swallowing the harsh Arctic sunlight without remorse. The sound that came from the depths was the first oddity, a continuous low hum, almost beyond the realm of human hearing. John felt it more than he heard it, the resonance vibrating in his bones. It was a primal, wrong sound, like the earth's marrow was groaning. Even more disturbing was the inexplicable climate around the hole. The ice and snow around it had melted into a soggy mire, giving the hole a 30-foot berth, and despite the freezing Arctic winds, standing near the edge felt like a balmy summer day. Days turned into weeks. Strange incidents started to pile up. Instruments stopped working or gave false readings. Compass needles spun erratically and satellite signals failed. The camp's huskies refused to go anywhere near the site, and their howling filled the still nights with dread. One night, a piercing scream echoed from the chasm. It was Harold, one of the crew members. They found his tent empty, his possessions scattered, and his footprints leading directly into the abyss. John organized a search, but no trace of Harold was found. No body, no blood, nothing. Harold's disappearance marked a turning point. The crew was filled with a pervasive sense of unease, as if they were intruders in a realm not meant for humans. John, however, was relentless. He couldn't let go. The mystery of the abyss was a siren's call to his curiosity. A week later, something else emerged from the depths. It wasn't a sound, but a force, a pressure. The very air seemed to thicken, becoming viscous and tangible, pulsating with an invisible rhythm. It was like the abyss was breathing. That same night, the fallen herald returned. He stumbled into the camp, his eyes vacant, his lips muttering strange, incoherent syllables. His skin was horribly burnt, as if exposed to extreme heat. He wasn't the herald they knew, but a hollow shell. The core, he kept repeating, like a broken record. That night, he died in his sleep, a peaceful expression on his face, as if he had found some profound relief in death. John finally decided to descend into the chasm. Rigged with climbing gear and armed with lights, he rappelled into the hole, a wireless camera broadcasting his descent to the terrified crew above. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the darkness became, and the stronger the strange hum. Hours passed. The abyss seemed to have no end. Then, abruptly, the line went slack. The crew on the surface watched in horror as the camera feed showed John looking at something in front of him, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. There, in the inky depths of the earth, illuminated by his shaky flashlight, was a gigantic, pulsating heart. It was entwined with veins and arteries that burrowed into the surrounding earth, its surface glossy and slick. With each beat, it sent waves of intense heat, the source of the strange climate. It was alive, connected to the earth, a grotesque mockery of life as they knew it. What have we done? John's voice was a whisper, filled with dread. As John's voice faded into the depths, the heart responded with a thunderous beat that reverberated through the chasm. The crew members on the surface clutched their ears in agony, feeling as if their very skulls were being crushed under the weight of the sound. The heart's pulsations intensified, its rhythm quickening, and the ground shook violently. Cracks spread like spider webs across the frozen landscape, swallowing tents and equipment whole. Panic gripped the remaining crew members as they scrambled to escape the crumbling campsite. Meanwhile, John found himself drawn closer to the colossal heart, unable to tear his eyes away from its mesmerizing yet horrifying presence. The heat emanating from it was oppressive, scorching his skin and searing his lungs with each breath. As he reached out a trembling hand to touch the pulsating organ, a voice echoed in his mind, a voice filled with ancient malevolence and seductive power. It whispered promises of unimaginable knowledge, untold secrets of the universe, and the chance to reshape reality itself. But there was a price, a terrible price that would forever alter his existence. Overwhelmed by the allure of the forbidden, John hesitated, his rational mind warring with an insidious curiosity. The voice grew more insistent, its tone dripping with malice, coercing him to surrender himself to the heart's dreadful embrace. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows behind John, a woman with wild, disheveled hair and a gaze filled with unyielding determination. It was Sarah, a fellow archaeologist and his closest companion on the expedition. She had managed to descend into the chasm, defying the overwhelming fear that gripped the others. "Spare yourself, John." Sarah's voice cut through the ethereal whispers, her words laden with desperation. "Can't you see? This thing, it's a parasite, a devourer of souls. It promises power, but only brings ruin." John's wavering resolve began to falter as he glimpsed the truth within Sarah's eyes. He withdrew his hand, the connection severed, the heart reacted with a thunderous bellow, its pulsations turning erratic and violent. Sarah grabbed John's arm, pulling him away from the abominable heart and urging him to ascend the rope, back toward the surface. They climbed frantically, each movement fraught with the overwhelming sense that they were being pursued by an unseen malevolence. As they neared the surface, the ground quaked violently, sending shockwaves through the ice and snow. The abyss convulsed, disgorging a horrific monstrosity, a grotesque amalgamation of sinew, bone, and pulsating flesh. Its many-eyed visage glowed with an otherworldly radiance, and its tentacle-like appendages thrashed violently, seeking prey. Sarah and John reached the surface just as the abomination breached the icy barrier. They stumbled backward, gasping for breath, their eyes widening in horror at the sight before them. The creature let out an unholy screech, piercing their eardrums and causing the surrounding landscape to crack and crumble. Then, with an unexpected burst of energy, the creature imploded, its form disintegrating into a cloud of black mist. The shockwave from its demise knocked John and Sarah off their feet, but they emerged relatively unscathed. Breathing heavily, the two survivors watched as the chasm closed before them, sealing away the heart and the unspeakable horrors it represented. They were left with only a desolate, scarred landscape as a haunting reminder of the darkness they had narrowly escaped. But as John and Sarah looked at each other, a realization dawned. The heart was not destroyed. It was merely contained, biding its time in the depths of the earth, waiting for another opportunity to ensnare unsuspecting souls. Ellen, a young woman in her 20s, worked the graveyard shift at Mercy Hospital. The only available bus ran until midnight, forcing her to trek back home through the dimly lit, desolate urban maze of New York City. Her apartment was 6 blocks away, but those blocks felt like miles under the moonless sky. One particular night, after a long and grueling shift, she felt the air was heavier than usual. There was a tension she could not shake off, a sensation of being watched. She looked back down the path she'd come from and saw nothing but an empty road bathed in sporadic lamplight. Then, from the shadowy alleys, a man emerged. At first, he was just a silhouette, a shifting shape amid the darkness. But as he stepped into the light, she could see his sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, and a strange, twisted smile. His gaze was fixed on her, making her blood run cold. He started to follow her, matching her steps, his silhouette stretching and morphing under the flickering streetlights. Part 2, the sinister pursuit. In fear, she quickened her pace, but the sound of his footsteps only grew louder. Her heart pounded in her chest as she began to run, her breath hitching. She could feel him closing in on her, his presence a haunting echo that resonated through the empty street. She darted down alleyways, her heels clattering against the wet asphalt. Yet he continued to pursue her, his panting growing more excited with every corner she turned. His footfalls echoed through the quiet streets, growing in intensity until they were the only thing she could hear. The city was silent, and in its silence, his pursuit became even more terrifying. Part II, the final showdown. Finally, Ellen reached her apartment building, its looming facade bathed in the glow of a solitary streetlight. The relief was short-lived. She fumbled with her keys, her trembling hands barely managing to push the key into the lock. His heavy footsteps were getting louder, closer. Sweat trickled down her spine as the echo of the shoes crunching gravel quickened. She was just about to push open the door when she felt his breath on her neck, heard a soft, guttural chuckle. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. In a sudden burst of adrenaline, she spun around, her hand reaching into her pocket and retrieving a small canister of pepper spray. She released it right into his face. He howled in agony, his hands clawing at his eyes. Part IV, the dawn of safety. Before he could recover, Ellen bolted through the entrance, slamming the heavy iron door behind her. She heard him pound against it, his screams reverberating through the cold night air. She collapsed against the door, her body shaking, her breath coming in short gasps. Suddenly, the apartment building was filled with flashing red and blue lights. The neighbors, alarmed by the commotion, had called the police. Ellen watched through the peephole as they apprehended the man writhing on the ground, blinded and disoriented. As they cuffed him, she allowed herself a small sigh of relief, her body finally beginning to relax. As the sun peeked over the horizon, bathing the city in a warm glow, Ellen realized her nightmare was over, though she knew she would never forget the chilling echo of those footsteps. As I stepped into the local bank, its cool, familiar ambience gave no indication that this day would be any different from the countless times I'd been here. I pulled a numbered ticket, adjusting the purse strap on my shoulder, thinking about the cup of tea I'd treat myself to afterwards. Suddenly, 3 masked individuals burst through the door, brandishing firearms and yelling commands. Panic exploded around me as screams filled the air, people falling to the ground to shield themselves. One robber approached the counter demanding cash, while the other two kept a watchful eye over us. My heart raced uncontrollably. I tried to keep still and invisible. The mother and child near me, the businessman, the teenager, we were all leveled by this palpable, choking fear. In the midst of it, the youngest-looking robber, jittery and clearly inexperienced, mistakenly fired his gun, embedding the bullet into the ceiling. The echo amplified our terror. From the corner of my eye, I saw one teller secretly trigger the alarm, but her slight movement was caught by the second robber. He didn't say a word, but the threat in his eyes was evident. She froze. When the robbers realized the police were outside due to the silent alarm, their panic mirrored ours. They became more erratic, shouting conflicting commands. The leader of the trio decided they needed a human shield to exit, and for reasons I'll never know, I was the unlucky choice. Cold steel pressed against my neck, the acrid smell of the gunman's sweat mixed with the undeniable scent of fear. As he dragged me toward the exit, I thought of my years in the classroom, the faces of countless students. This couldn't be my end. Outside, the glaring sun blinded me momentarily. The leader's grip on my arm tightened, and my legs nearly gave way from sheer terror. The police surrounded the bank, their megaphones urging the robbers to surrender. Every inch we moved felt like miles, every second an eternity. The robbers' hurried breathing echoed my own. I wasn't brave, wasn't planning to be a hero. I was just an old school teacher, and all I could think about was surviving. Then, out of nowhere, a car horn blared. It startled the gunman, causing him to momentarily loosen his grip. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I simply fell to the ground instinctively. In the split seconds that followed, the police acted. The robbers, distracted and outnumbered, were quickly apprehended. Later, people said I was clever to drop when I did. But in truth, it wasn't bravery or intelligence. It was raw, paralyzing fear. The trauma of that day never truly left me. The bank's familiar walls became a place of nightmares, the sun's rays a reminder of blinding terror. But amidst the fear, there was a new appreciation for the fragility of life and the unpredictability of each day. The pounding of rain against the roof echoed through the house, competing with the booming rolls of thunder. A kaleidoscope of light, like frozen lightning, cast eerie shadows across the room. I was alone, 16 years old, and my first time in this quiet, almost painfully suburban house without my parents. I hated thunderstorms, but tonight, the thrumming rain felt like a comforting blanket, muffling the rest of the world from me. Or so I thought. An hour into the storm, nestled in the comforting crevices of a worn-out couch, engrossed in an old novel, I heard it, a scraping sound, like nails dragging across the wooden siding of the house. I froze, listening. Maybe it was just a tree branch in the wind, I told myself. The wind and the storm could play odd tricks on your ears. But then it came again, a gnashing, grinding noise, louder this time, followed by a muffled thump, as though something or someone had thrown their weight against the door. A primal, icy fear crawled up my spine, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, matching the rhythm of the storm outside. Taking a deep breath, I tiptoed to the front window and peered through the slit in the blinds. It was almost impossible to make out anything in the rain-drenched darkness, save for an occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the yard in stark white light. The next peal of thunder shook the house and me with it. My breath hitched as my eyes caught a shadow, something formless and dark, huddled by the door. There was someone there, scrabbling at the doorknob, pushing against the door in rhythmic thuds. My heart pounded with a mix of terror and adrenaline. I was alone, without any immediate help. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, but just as I unlocked it, the lights flickered and went out. The storm had claimed the electricity. My fear escalated, the darkness of the house swallowing me up. The only illumination was the sporadic, ghostly glow from the storm outside. Emotions churned within me, fear, horror, and a rising paranoia. Each sound was magnified, the crack of thunder, the creaking of the house, the splatter of rain against the window, and overall, the relentless, sickening scrapes and thuds at the door. The intruder was persistent. Gulping back tears, I dialed 911. A dispassionate voice answered, promising help would come. But with the storm, It could take time. Time I wasn't sure I had. After what felt like hours, the assault on the door stopped. An eerie silence filled the house, only broken by the distant murmur of the storm. I didn't dare to breathe. I felt hunted, watched, an uneasiness pricking at my senses. Then, a guttural growl echoed from the back of the house. The intruder had moved to the back door. Suddenly, the front door burst open, the wind and rain howling through the entryway. I screamed, running towards the back of the house, away from the open door. But I skidded to a stop as the back door, too, creaked open, revealing nothing but the stormy night beyond. I was trapped. Tears streamed down my face, blending with the cold sweat beating on my forehead. Suddenly, two beams of light flooded through the front door. I heard the blare of a siren, and my knees buckled in relief. The police were here. I raced towards the front door, the rain whipping my face as I staggered outside. A figure stepped out of the police car, but it was not an officer. It was my neighbor, Mr. Harris, a sheepish look on his face. "I'm sorry, kid," he stammered. "I had one too many drinks, thought this was my house." In the quaint little town of Eldridge, Nebraska, nestled amidst the rustling cornfields, there exists a bizarre annual tradition. On the eve of each year's harvest, when the moon hangs low and orange in the sky, the town congregates in the town hall, holding a vigil until dawn. They call it the Night of the Harvest Watch. Outsiders consider it quaint, even charming, but the people of Eldridge know better. It's not tradition, it's survival. The tradition started after a string of odd occurrences and sudden disappearances in the town many decades ago. Elders speak of the Shadow Eater, a spectral entity from a time before the town existed. A creature drawn to the darkness within the human heart, feeding off fear, despair, and loneliness. It was said to come with the harvest moon, an eerie omen that blanketed Eldridge with dread. Our protagonist, John McKenna, a disillusioned journalist from New York, arrived in Eldridge, drawn by the allure of the mysterious tradition. He hoped to reignite his stagnant career, believing that the fears of Eldridge would make an enticing story. That evening, as the townsfolk huddled together in the town hall, John chose to observe from afar. He stationed himself in a small inn that overlooked the hall. As midnight drew near, he felt a shift in the air. It became dense, almost tangible, carrying an undercurrent of fear that made his hair stand on end. The townsfolk's fear wasn't baseless superstition. It was palpable, bone-deep, and real. Suddenly, a cry echoed from the town hall. John rushed to his window, his heart pounding. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, had enveloped the building. It seemed alive, shifting, and contorting. Panic-stricken cries filled the night as the Shadow Eater made its presence known. Barely thinking, John grabbed his camera and ran towards the hall. This was the story of his career. As he approached, the air grew colder, the fear thicker. Suddenly, the front doors burst open, and out stumbled a man, his face twisted in terror. The darkness pursued him, wrapping tendrils around him, pulling him back towards the hall. Then John felt it, a coldness creeping into his heart, a bleakness that threatened to consume him. His deepest fears began to surface, their intensity magnified tenfold. The fear of failure, of dying alone and unloved. It was the Shadow Eater, reaching into him, finding the darkness within his heart. Driven by a sudden realization, John lifted his camera and snapped a picture. The flash cut through the darkness like a knife. The shadow shrieked, recoiling from the sudden light. It released its victim and retreated, disappearing back into the night from whence it came. The vigil ended. The townsfolk stepped out, looking shaken but relieved. John understood then. The vigil wasn't an act of fear, it was defiance. A stand against the darkness that threatened to consume them. The Shadow Eater, he realized, fed not only off fear, but off loneliness and isolation as well. The unity of the townsfolk was their defense, their shared fear their shield. The Harvest Watch wasn't about avoiding the shadow, but confronting it. The story John wrote was different than he intended. It wasn't about a town living in fear, but a town standing united against it. His article earned him widespread acclaim and reignited his career, but he chose to stay in Eldridge. The experience had changed him. teaching him the power of unity and the strength that came from confronting his fears. Every year, when the harvest moon shone in the sky, John would stand with the townsfolk, no longer an observer but a participant. The Shadow Eater still came, but now it faced a town unwilling to be consumed by their fears. Nestled in the heart of the Canadian wilderness, there was a remote sanctuary, isolated amidst the stoic mountain range and the unforgiving boreal forest. The desolate hotel, appropriately named the Frostbite, rose like a monolith against the harsh environment, a solitary beacon of human presence in the vast, unending expanse. It was this secluded hotel that I had selected for my retreat as I sought refuge from the clamorous world that throbbed outside my window. I am a middle-aged novelist, and the crippling noise and pace of urban life had worn me thin. A writer, I believe, thrives on silence and solitude, and the Frostbite, with its distant location and sparse clientele, seemed like the perfect haven. Each room was a cocoon, effectively soundproofed against the howling winds and the occasional murmurs of the neighboring guests. But there was one room adjacent to mine that held a sense of foreboding, room 303. It was the third day of my stay when I first noticed the man occupying room 303. He was a gaunt figure, an embodiment of profound grief, his eyes deep pools of desolation. He radiated an air of discomfort that sent ripples through my otherwise serene world, unsettling the calm surface of my solitude. In the days that followed, I noticed a chilling pattern. Late into the night, the man paced back and forth in his room, his footsteps echoing like a haunting symphony against the solid oak flooring. Sometimes, whispers of uncanny monologues escaped through the walls, punctuated by the unnerving sound of his laughter, disturbing the otherwise peaceful silence of the Frostbite. One evening, as I returned from a walk, a nauseating odor greeted me outside his door. It was a sickening amalgamation of metallic tang and decay, a scent that crawled into the nostrils and clung to the senses. The stench was so overwhelming that I found myself retching, my body rejecting the repugnant aroma with a visceral reaction. The very next day, I spotted him struggling to dispose of a large object, hastily concealed in a blood-stained sheet. His knuckles were white as they clung to the gruesome parcel, and a sheen of sweat covered his deathly pale face. Our eyes met, and a sudden chill seized me, an icy grip of terror that eclipsed all reason. That moment sparked an avalanche of dreadful thoughts. My mind was set ablaze with horrifying possibilities. The man's disturbing behavior, the repulsive smell, and the horrific parcel. The sinister puzzle pieces were falling into place, but I shrank from the picture they were forming. Resolute to confront him, I found myself standing before the door of room 303. My fist rose to knock but paused in midair. A wave of apprehension washed over me. I mustered my courage and rapped on the door. The sound echoed in the silence, unanswered. An eerie stillness hung in the air, sending shivers down my spine. My ear pressed against the cold door, straining for any sound, was met with an unsettling silence. Frantic, I sought the hotel manager. I relayed my concerns, my voice shaking as I recounted the peculiar behaviors of the man from room 303. The manager, a burly, pragmatic man, seemed skeptical but was swayed by my obvious distress. The door to room 303 creaked open under the careful hands of the manager, revealing a scene that was beyond any ghastly figment of my imagination. The room was a horrifying tableau, painted in varying shades of crimson. Centered in the room, splayed out grotesquely on the bed, lay the mutilated corpse of a wild boar. Its entrails were strewn around in a macabre display, the sight of which turned my stomach. The manager, ashen-faced, dialed the local authorities, his fingers trembling. I found myself leaning heavily against the wall, trying to reconcile the chilling scene with reality. The air was thick with the stench of death, and the silent accusation of the grotesque sight burned into my retinas. When the authorities arrived, their subsequent investigation unearthed a story that was more horrifying than the grisly scene itself. The man from room 303 was a renowned wildlife biologist suffering from severe psychosis. In his deranged state, he had hunted and killed the boar, deluded into believing that he was conducting groundbreaking scientific research. His insanity was revealed when he was found the next day, wandering aimlessly through the forest, repeating saving humanity in a crazy mantra. The hotel, the forest, the tranquility, everything was tainted with the residue of this terrifying episode. Every night, at the stroke of 11, I leave my cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town to make my way to Mickey's 24/7's convenience store. Tonight was no different. As usual, I'm the only living soul on the pothole-ridden streets, save for the occasional mangy alley cat on the prowl. Working the graveyard shift at Mickey's wasn't my first choice. In fact, it wasn't even my last choice, but tuition isn't going to pay itself. The solitude is what gets to me the most, just me, the buzzing fluorescent lights, and rows upon rows of prepackaged food and cheap liquor. At precisely 3:33 a.m., the bells over the door jingled, their usually cheerful sound dissonant in the dead of the night, and walked a man, draped in a tattered, mud-caked overcoat that hung loosely over his skeletal frame. His face, partially hidden beneath a weathered fedora, was a gaunt specter, pale with hollowed eyes that stared unblinkingly ahead. He carried an aura of malevolence that filled the room, making the air feel heavier. The fluorescent lights flicker and buzz more urgently. As he walked, his shoes squeaked on the pristine linoleum floor, leaving a trail of dirty footprints that gradually darkened to a sickly, rotten black. Each step felt like a heartbeat, growing louder and more terrifying with every passing second. His shadow, grotesque and elongated, danced with a life of its own, shape-shifting in the harsh store light. Ignoring the wall of chips and candy bars, he made his way straight to the back, disappearing into the chilled air of the refrigerator section. The sound of his breath echoed across the silence, a ghoulish wheeze that was sickeningly wet, as though he was gargling water mixed with thick phlegm. The man was an anomaly in the monotonous cycle of drunks and insomniacs that usually frequented Mickey's. My palms were damp, my heart pounding against my ribs like a wild animal caught in a trap. I took slow, deep breaths, trying to ease the rising panic within me. I wasn't one to get scared easily, but this man, this creature, filled me with a dread I'd never experienced before. For what felt like an eternity, he lingered, his ragged breath and occasional scratchy cough the only sound in the otherwise quiet store. When he finally emerged, his bony hand clutched a single item, a carton of milk. As he placed it on the counter, a waft of decaying flesh and wet earth hit me, making me gag. His eyes finally met mine, cold and lifeless as a shark's. I could see a bottomless hunger within, a craving that couldn't be satiated by food or drink. It was a void that yearned to devour everything it came across, a dark abyss that threatened to swallow me whole. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave the money in the till and get out, but I was trapped, stuck in this late-night nightmare, with a tuition bill hanging over me like a guillotine. I tried to steady my voice as I announced the total. As he reached into his pocket, my heart pounded even harder. His hand emerged holding a few crumpled bills, but beneath the bills, a metallic glint caught my eye, a switchblade, hidden, but unmistakably there. Time seemed to freeze, my life hanging in the balance, dictated by the actions of a stranger. My mind raced, formulating a plan. I needed a weapon, something to level the playing field. The milk, it was my only chance. As I reached for the carton, I deliberately knocked it over, the liquid splashing all over the counter. Catching the stranger off guard, in his moment of surprise, I grabbed the cash tray from the register, its hefty weight reassuring in my grip. With a primal scream, I swung it at him, hitting him square in the jaw. He stumbled backward, crashing into the shelves, causing a shower of canned goods to rain down around him. With a surge of adrenaline, I dashed for the phone behind the counter, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. Within minutes, the piercing sound of sirens cut through the silent night, ending the deafening silence that had taken over the store. As the police stormed the store, they found the man, unconscious, amidst the mess of spilled milk and scattered goods. The switchblade lay on the floor beside him, the true intent of his visit chillingly clear. This was no ordinary customer, the police explained. He was a known felon, having already claimed the lives of several late-night workers in surrounding towns. As they carted him away, I sat, wrapped in a shock blanket, trembling from the encounter. I had survived a brush with death. A new day was dawning, and the night shift was finally over. The engine stuttered, gasped, and gave out. My heart froze as the headlights flickered, then dimmed. It was late, far too late, and I was stranded on a narrow, deserted road, surrounded by a dense forest that was almost suffocating. The only sounds were the nocturnal whispers of nature and the rapid beat of my heart, echoing in my ears. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to process the next steps. I'd always been the sort to meticulously plan out my road trips, accounting for every variable. I'd never imagined I'd end up here. Pulling out my phone, I hoped to see bars of signal, but as expected, no service. I exhaled deeply. Think, I muttered to myself. I knew there was a small town about 20 miles back. Going forward was uncertain, and it would be folly to venture deeper into unknown territory. The logical step was to head back. Turning on the hazard lights, I stepped out, the sharp cold air stinging my face. Every tiny noise seemed amplified, every rustle a potential threat. I started walking briskly, occasionally glancing behind. I wasn't sure if it was my paranoia or something real, but I felt like I was being watched. About 2 miles in, headlights approached. The relief was immense. Finally, I thought, someone can give me a lift. But as the car neared, it slowed down, almost crawling past me. Inside, I could make out a dark silhouette. The car didn't stop, but there was something profoundly unsettling about that slow drive-by. The back of my neck tingled as I watched the car's red taillights grow smaller in the distance. 10 minutes later, the same car came back from the direction I was heading. It slowed down, crawling again as it passed me. Panic set in. Why was this car patrolling this desolate road? My instincts screamed at me. I dove into the trees, trying to keep my breath quiet. The car stopped right where I'd been standing. The door creaked open. Silence. Moments felt like hours. Then I heard footsteps shuffling through the gravel. He's gone. A deep voice rumbled. Another voice, raspy and cold, responded. We'll find him. My mind raced, calculating odds, outcomes, risks. Should I make a run for it? Should I wait? But then a light shone through the trees. A flashlight. They were searching for me. Determined to avoid detection, I began moving deeper into the woods. I tried to move silently, avoiding twigs, but every rustle and snap seemed deafening. After what felt like hours, the faint sound of a distant highway reached my ears. Elated, I picked up my pace, desperate to reach safety. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me. I tumbled down a sharp incline, my world a blur of pain and fear. When I finally came to a stop, I was at the bottom of a ditch. My leg throbbed, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had twisted my ankle. Forcing myself to stand, I limped towards the highway sounds. Just as the road came into view, headlights illuminated the area. The same car. My heart sank. I prepared for the worst. As the car neared, the window rolled down. But to my shock, it wasn't the strangers from before. A familiar face looked out. Dave? My voice was barely a whisper. John? What the hell are you doing out here? Dave was an old college buddy. I quickly relayed my ordeal. He looked horrified. We need to get out of here, he said urgently. This road is known for unexplained disappearances. We drove in silence, the weight of my near miss sinking in. When we reached the nearest town, Dave told me more. Locals avoided that road, talking of gangs that preyed on stranded motorists. I was just grateful to have made it out, thanks to a chance encounter with an old friend. I'd never look at a deserted road the same way again. The thrill of adventure was replaced by a cold realization. Sometimes terror lurks in the most unexpected places.